This is a Shoosmiths podcast.
Welcome to our next episode of the Shoospeak HR podcast. The two Amy's and I are really excited today and are delighted to welcome Sam Westwood. He's the head of people at the White Company. Sam is an amazing HR professional. I know that because he tells me so. No, I'm joking. I know that because whenever I speak to people who have worked with or for him, they tell me that. So Sam, welcome.
Hello, thank you. What an introduction.
No, we're genuinely delighted to have you. You won't be surprised to hear we've got a few questions for you. But before we kind of move to the more serious stuff, first question, what, obviously apart from our podcast, is your podcast of choice?
And obviously, this podcast is right up there. So I think I'm going to say I've listened to sort of a few kind of over the time, some serious, some a bit more silly. So I'm going to pull out a silly one, which is a podcast called Bud Pod. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's a comedy podcast hosted by two stand-up comedians who I think met at University in Cambridge, a guy called Phil Wang and Pierre Novelli. It's really stupid, a bit surreal in places. They kind of review the week, take kind of communication from some of the listeners, etc. And it's just very satirical, quite fun. And you should check it out. I'm not on commission, by the way, but it is good.
Like the sound of that. Fab. All right, well, we're going to move through some questions. Now, I think this podcast may generate interest from other HR professionals. So to the extent that anybody has questions for us and or Sam, and we haven't asked him those questions, then by all means, email us the usual way, shoospeakhr@shoosmith.co.uk. I probably should answer the question on Sam's behalf anyway. Initially is that no, unfortunately, he can't give you any free products. I know that's probably a question he gets asked a lot. So, Sam Westwood, you're in the hot seat. What's your organisation's biggest challenge in the next 12 months?
Probably the biggest challenge is not giving out free products to people, especially as it gets to Christmas time. Constantly, not at the moment, but going to dinner parties and people, the first thing that they see when you tell them you work for the White Company is their eyes light up and they think you can get discount. But no, that's not the case. So thank you for reiterating that point. Biggest challenge, biggest people challenge, I suppose. Would it be a complete cop-out to say uncertainty?
I thought you were going to say COVID, so I was like, well, anything but COVID.
You can probably see where this is going. It's definitely a COVID theme. So I think, although obviously there is light at the end of the tunnel now with the various vaccines that have been trialled and look quite successful, I think the reason I say uncertainty is, and I'm by no means a psychologist. I've got a twin sister who's actually done 2 PhDs in clinical psychology. So if she were to listen to this, she would probably say, no, you're absolutely wrong. But I think principally people associate uncertainty with quite a negative response other than being quite optimistic about it. So I don't know, if you think about if you're uncertain whether or not it's going to rain one day, you'll always take an umbrella kind of on the off chance it will, as opposed to being quite optimistic that it won't, and brave it. And I think the old adage of sort of fear of the unknown kind of comes into this. So it has this kind of negative fear response to it, which is, I think, playing on everyone's lives and putting pressure on work as well. And I think I'll give you a couple of examples around kind of how that's then played out. Is, just on a very basic level, employee relations, people have been kind of fearful and kind of uncertain around kind of, being safe at work, and us needing to kind of manage that kind of employment relationships really carefully and kind of more kind of carefully than we previously may have done. I think as well, just uncertainty around not being able to plan. So you've got sort of that's gone out the window completely, and so we're just sort of being much more reactive, and it's putting pressure on people to turn things around really quickly and be up to speed with various different things. So I know the furlough scheme this year, for example, it's just a prime example of that. uncertainty of when we can open our stores and when we need to close them, what restrictions that we've got in particular areas. And I think it just, all of that builds pressure on people at work. So I think there's this kind of role that we have as HR, as business leaders to navigate that uncertainty and provide clarity and reassurance, have that really strong leadership, encouraging people to come together and remembering that they're one part of one team, and kind of doing that together. So I think that's, a bit of a cop-out, but I think it's having a lot of different effects on the psyche of work. And if I may just add to that, the challenge around culture, and we don't know what the long-term impact on our culture is going to be around remote working and our continuation of that. I think we've already seen an impact of our ability to train people and induct people into roles. So having a response to that continued and long drawn out kind of inevitable sort of people working remotely is something that we need to sort of overcome as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly from speaking to various clients and even employees, that the uncertainty is massive. People just can't plan. And equally, as much as leadership can be strong, it can be, effective, and the communication's out there, the piece is fantastic, but the reality is that nobody is able to say with any certainty what is going to happen, in 2 weeks, let alone 2 months and 6 months and everything else. So absolutely understand that, Sam.
Yeah, and I think as well, it's just there's some people that are very good at navigating ambiguity, and there's certain people that aren't, and I think therefore there is a bit of a polarization around that in the workplace, because you've got some people that aren't necessarily appreciating kind of what the other people might be feeling, and therefore you do get a kind of this tension, I suppose, and this kind of conflict that plays out in various different scenarios.
No, absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to stop asking you to be Mystic Meg. I think that was a tough first question. But can you articulate your biggest career highlight and perhaps low point as well in the HR world?
What you mean, other than record this podcast, which is obviously a particular highlight?
Didn't like to say, but thank you for saying so.
So I think probably when I think about the highlights of my career and where I've enjoyed it the most is probably a good way of looking at it. And I think when I look at it from that perspective, it always revolves around the team that I'm working with, or have been able to work with. And I think I've been really, really lucky throughout my career to work with some amazing people and deliver some really great things. And I've made some amazing friends along the way in doing that. I think more recently in kind of my role, I've had the pleasure of building a fantastic team of really passionate people. I couldn't be more proud of them. But then you're probably like, that's a bit of a cop-out too, because you've just been really general. So I will further expand on that perhaps. So I think this year is a huge example of where that team has really come together to deliver. And whilst I think maybe I'm a bit reluctant to say the last year has been a career highlight, given the damage and devastation that the pandemic has done to society and people and relationships, etc. But equally, having to come to terms with the furlough scheme. I keep mentioning that. You can't see me spitting once I say that. But the team has absolutely kind of come together, and really, really proud on the response that we've done and how everyone's adapted, developed, etc. I talked to my team about the fact that this has been the biggest learning curve of your life, and it is just amazing on the job learning and development, and it's probably catapulted people's HR kind of development and careers forward, a couple of years. So although it might have been hard work, it's something to look back and be really, really proud about.
No, that's really interesting. And I think a lot of people will probably resonate with that as well, in the HR sectors and roles, especially with the furlough scheme. I mean, even ourselves as employment lawyers, we've had to kind of grapple with it too and get to grips with it. So yeah, we definitely relate to that. Kind of, I suppose, a sort of different angle question from me. So you obviously talk about highlights and lowlights. What's the most bizarre situation you've come across in your career to date?
I dread to think.
That's a very good question. That's a very, very good question indeed. At the beginning of my career, I used to work for a quick service restaurant brand. A quick Google of my LinkedIn will find out which. Part of that role was to answer the HR helpline to employees, and I think we had about 90,000 employees. So it was quite a busy hotline. So you had to get used to quite strange situations doing that role. I remember we were dealing with one situation whereby a father of one of our employees, because they were quite young employees, would ring in and say, "Oh, well, little Johnny hasn't been paid for his shifts," and so we rang the restaurant and found out that actually little Johnny hadn't been showing up for his shifts. His dad had dropped him off at the gate, and then he'd then walked off and kind of not shown up for his shift and done whatever with his friends. So we had the pleasure of calling the father back and confirming this. And as we did, in the background, you could hear, "Johnny, get down the stairs." So yeah, unfortunately, we're responsible for a bit of a telling off there, I think. So lots and lots of bizarre situations. I think you just kind of get used to them doing the role that we do. Nothing seems to faze me anymore, which is, I don't know if it's a good thing, but yeah.
Oh, I was going to say it's quite an interesting start, especially if you were early on in your kind of HR career at that stage as well. Probably opened your eyes to...
You just think that's how every business operates,
Yeah.
and then you go and work at a different business, like, oh no, actually that was crazy.
Oh, absolutely. I suppose talking about your role now with the White Company, what would you say is the most interesting part of your role at the moment, and why?
Obviously working with employment lawyers.
Great answer.
Well, no, that can be
It's almost
extremely...
like we paid Sam a fee for this, isn't it?
If you detect the hint of sarcasm. So no, I think that can be extremely interesting, and I think, well, mainly because I'm normally learning something. So I think, and that's, I guess, to the point. The most interesting part is when you're learning something new, and when you feel like you're really developing new skills or experiences. And I think this, within my role at the White Company, it's a lot smaller business than I'd ever worked for before. So naturally, the roles are a lot broader than what you would have done in previous large organisations. So I think there's lots of opportunity therefore to get involved with new things that you don't have that experience with. So that's always the bit that's really interesting. So I remember one of the first projects I worked on when I started was we were opening a store in the US, in New York, crack on, like develop the people proposition and get on with it. And I'd had very limited experience with kind of jurisdictions in other countries, let alone the US, which is just an absolute minefield with sort of city, state and federal laws. So it was a huge learning curve, not just from understanding that side of things, but understanding the culture, etc. So I think it is that kind of being able to learn new things and practice it too that I find the most interesting, and that's what kind of keeps me excited, I think.
So we've done obviously the most interesting part of your job. What's the hardest lesson that you've learned during your career? This is a tricky one, I think.
Hardest lesson, never trust a lawyer. No.
That's an easy lesson.
For me, I'd say attention to detail it's not my strongest point in the slightest. I'm much more want to focus on the bigger picture, but I think it's really kind of made me come undone a couple of times. I think everyone's probably done it at one stage in their career, but you've sent that email about someone to the person that you've written it about. And it could be kind of feedback on performance or around their talent rating or even someone else's salary I've done previously. So I think, it's just check for me because it's landed me in all sorts of difficult situations through my career.
If it makes you feel any better, Sam, I have probably had the very worst example of that, and it ended up in tribunal. It was a nightmare for the client concerned, but it does happen to lots of people.
It happens to the best of us.
You definitely won't be alone in that one, Sam. And then I guess finally, how do you see the world of HR changing in the future? And I guess, do you think this is like, do you think that's changed more? Will it change more because of obviously COVID? What are your thoughts on this?
So you're asking me to whip my crystal ball out again?
That's exactly what I'm asking you to do, yes.
I do look very good in a robe, so I'm okay with it. So I think this year has really accelerated, maybe that's not the right word, amplified maybe, the role that HR plays in a business. So if we weren't at the top table before the pandemic, we certainly are now. So I think the challenge is going to be how we are able to maintain that in a real sustainable way that adds sustainable value to an organization, and not just value from an economic sense, because I think the world is developing and changing and the purpose of organization is changing. So you're talking about value from a societal, from an environmental as well as economic kind of point. So I think, from that point, HR has never needed to understand the whole business proposition, like kind of more, in order to contribute towards the direction, navigation of the whole business and not just the kind of people element to it. So you've kind of got this pressure from the top down happening, I think. But equally, I think there's another trend around the pressure from the bottom up, if you like, which is that HR or people or whatever you want to call it is becoming a lot more experience-led. So you've got this idea of employee experience being kind of the holy grail of what we're there to achieve as an organization. So you've got this kind of bottom-up kind of pressure as well as this kind of top-down, and I think it's around connecting to both of those as a HR function and not losing sight of either of them. But it's still a difficult challenge to have, I think, flying at both of those levels and doing everything in between. So I think that's kind of where I see the function moving more. And I think to the point, it has absolutely been amplified by the pandemic.
Yeah.
No, I agree, actually. And like you say, Sam, in terms of businesses perhaps realizing just how important the people are, and obviously then the subsequent management of those people, and how that pieces together the business, and creates the brand and everything else. So absolutely. Well, Sam, that has been really, really insightful, really helpful. It's kind of opened my eyes to the world of HR that you've been living over the last 12 months and beyond. So we can't thank you enough for your time today. We appreciate it's precious. And I can honestly say and can see from the smiles around the virtual desk that we're at today that it's been a real pleasure for all of us. So thank you. And like I said earlier in the podcast, if anybody does have any queries for Sam, I can't guarantee he'll answer them, but if you want to direct them to shoospeakhr@shoosmiths.co.uk, we will funnel them through. I think some of his stories he can't really elaborate on further.
We might have to get you back for another episode. So.
We may need to do an anonymous version.
Yeah, your book. You should do a book of like tales of the HR helpline.
I've been thinking about doing something like that.
But...
So thank you, Sam, and take care.
Thank you, guys.
Cheers.